Joma Onyato tonight. President Buhari presents 2017 Appropriation Bill to a joint session of the National Assembly, proposes 7.298 trillion naira for expenditure. Senate calls for the resignation and prosecution of Secretary to the Government of the Federation for alleged involvement in contract for Northeast humanitarian crisis. Staff and students of the Abafemi Awolowo University in Ile-Ife take to the streets of Ibadan to protest the arrest of the institution's vice-chancellor by the EFCC. And fresh fighting breaks out in Aleppo, halting evacuation of rebel fighters and civilians from the troubled Syrian city. On business news tonight, federal government to improve infrastructure as President Buhari presents the country's spending plans for 2017.
And on sports news tonight, Nigeria's Super Falcons staged protests at the gates of the National Assembly, demanding payment of bonuses and allowances.
Hello, I'm Ibrahim Adra, and from Abuja, Rivers State Governor Nyesom Wike calls for the review of the state's legislative rerun polls, as police arrest suspects alleged to have been involved in the disruption of the polls.
We begin tonight in Abuja, the Federal Capital Territory, where the President today presented Nigeria's 2017 budget of 7.298 trillion naira to the National Assembly. President Muhammadu Buhari explained that the document will be a continuation of the 2016 plans with new additions aimed at stimulating the economy. Out of the proposed total sum, 2.98 trillion naira has been earmarked for recurrent expenditure, while capital expenditure is put at 2.24 trillion naira.
With 2017 around the corner, it's time for the government to project for the next fiscal year. This informs the gathering of the nation's policymakers here at the National Assembly for the presentation of the 2017 budget by President Muhammadu Buhari.
We go forward.
Opening the floor for the day's business, the Senate President Bukola Saraki makes the task before the senators known.
The National Assembly on this part listed and prioritized 11 economic reform bills for passage. We intend to get these bills ready alongside the 2017 Appropriation Bill. We believe that these core elements of this bill will aid the executive in mobilizing the required private capital into the general economy.
Hence, the much expected moment is here. President Buhari reviews the performance of the 2016 budget, explaining how the drop in oil prices and the persistent attacks on oil facilities prevented its successful implementation.
As at 30th September 2016, aggregate revenue inflow was 2.17 trillion naira, or 25% less than prorated projections. Similarly, 3.58 trillion naira had been spent by the same date on both recurrent and capital expenditure.
The President then proceeds to the focus of the 2017 Appropriation Bill, estimated at 7.298 trillion naira.
The proposed aggregate expenditure of 7.298 trillion naira will comprise A. Statutory transfers of 419.02 billion naira, B. Debt service of 1.66 trillion naira, C. Sinking fund of 177.46 billion to retire certain maturity bonds, D. Non-debt recurrent expenditure of 2.98 trillion naira, and E. Capital expenditure of 2.24 trillion naira, including statutory transfers.
The 2017 budget represents a 20.4% increase over last year's budget. With the economic recession as the main challenge of the federal government, Nigerians can only hope that the proposed budget is passed in time to address the pressing economic issues in the new year. Temple Ashaju, Channels Television News.
Meanwhile, lawmakers in the National Assembly are divided over the 7.298 trillion naira budget of recovery and growth presented to the National Assembly by the President Muhammadu Buhari. Speaking with Channels Television, some of the lawmakers applauded the thrust and the strategy outlined by the President, saying they are confident the budget will bring the economy out of recession. Others, however, raised concerns over the funding of the proposed budget and its focus. Our correspondent Larry Lassisi reports.
Heads of state of the ECOWAS region.
President Muhammadu Buhari presenting the 2017 budget of recovery and growth to a joint session of the National Assembly. The president says the 7.298 trillion naira budget is expected to bring the economy out of recession to a path of steady growth and prosperity. After the budget is laid and the president leaves, some lawmakers applaud the budget as outlined by the president.
Key area again that I appreciated what he said was on the deficit. Has gone down. Last year it was about 3 trillion, but now it's about 2.3 trillion. So it's a gradual process. And if the domestic debtors are being taken care of, definitely again is going to enhance the living standard and economic activity.
I believe that this budget, of course, is built for the people, not just a few, but for the generality of our country, and I believe is one that will, of course, affect the lives of other Nigerians.
Most of the things he outlined are based on assumptions. It is the duty of the National Assembly to look at this critically well and see where we can put the figures and make sure that we come out with a realizable budget.
For others, however, the budget has some grey areas.
And if we're talking about an increased budget of 7-point-something trillion, as against 6 point for last year, and as against where we are coming from, 3.4 trillion, I think that it doesn't really make sense to hear that 70% of 7-point-something trillion is for recurrent.
And whereas we are looking at about 4.7 trillion from some certain sources, those sources are not really, in reality, what can really assist Nigeria in getting the appropriate funding.
I would have loved to see a situation where the National Assembly is more empowered. We need to have better capacity training, better building, better able to do our oversight without relying on the agencies and people who go to oversight. That also requires a lot of money.
The lawmakers say they look forward to considering the details of the 2017 budget estimates, even as they give assurances that they will make sure that the budget is passed on time. Lanre Lassese, Channels Television News.
Now, the implementation of the 2016 Appropriation Bill was hampered by some negative factors, as referenced by President Muhammadu Buhari today. While the 2017 budget is planned to turn the economy around, here's a background on the implications of this year's budget. Our business news editor, Bosun Omofai, reports.
This is President Buhari's second budget presentation since taking office in 2015, and it comes at a time when the economy faces one of its worst performances since the Civil War some 50 years ago. Last year, the administration's first budget of 6.6 trillion presented in December was messy. No thanks to the delay in its preparation, the scandalous pardon allegations, and almost 4 months' delay of its passage. But despite the false starts, the government was optimistic about the deliverables of its first fiscal appropriations. Events of the year 2016 seem, however, to have thrown spanners in the works in terms of the assumptions and hopes that the budget offers. Oil prices continue to decline. Militant activities reach record high, slamming revenue, while the specter of scarce foreign exchange hurts industrial production and non-oil exports. The result was an economic recession. As President Buhari presents another set of revenue and spending proposals for the new year, one of the chief concerns of Nigerians is implementation.
It has been difficult.
Dubbed a budget of recovery and growth, President Buhari hinges his administration's success on the 7.3 trillion naira document derived from the National Economic Recovery Plans. But will 2017 budget deliver economic growth and recovery to 160 million Nigerians in the new year? That's a question for which the clock now begins to tick for the administration. Both in Mofaye, Channels Business News.
Now to take a look at Budget 2017 and expectations from the National Assembly, I'm now being joined on the News at 10 by the Chairman, Senate Committee on Finance, Mr. John Eno. He joins me from Abuja. Thanks for joining us on the News at 10.
Yeah, thank you.
Now, before we get into this new presentation, let's back up a little bit and look at the implementation of the 2016 budget. That budget is still running. Are you satisfied with the level of implementation of that budget?
Well, so far, I mean, it's given the fact that that budget, actually came into effect about May or so. That means effectively that budget has been run for about 7 months, and I think that even a couple of about 7 months, what we have as implementation figures out of a 6-point-something trillion naira budget is that about 3.7 trillion has been expended, of which about 700 billion, has been expended for capital. And given the fact that the National Assembly had actually insisted that every budget has to be operated through a 12 calendar period, I mean, the hope is that in the next 5 months or thereabout, much of this is going to be achieved. And I think that so far not too bad, given the timing and when the implementation started.
But in terms of the speed of passage, that budget did have its problems, bogged down by the padding, the whole padding controversy, inconsistency with the figures. How can we do it differently now that this 2017 budget is going to be debated on? Are we going to have the same thing, or what should we do differently this time around?
Well, let's hope that everybody that was involved, both from the executive and from the legislature, in the 2016, all the issues that delayed it, from the first time that the budget document was laid, and all the accusations back and forth, to when these were cleared, and then the committees of the National Assembly, and all the issues about padding and not padding. Let's hope that everybody has learned his or her lesson, and let's hope that we're going to start consideration of the 2017 budget document in earnest, without these issues. And I think that if these are all out of the way, I don't think that there should be much delay in terms of the actual processing and passage of the 2017 appropriation bill.
But already you can see the lawmakers disagreeing on this presentation. They've already started talking about funding, where is it going to come from, and the focus of the budget. Do you see that as the beginning?
Well, I don't think that the focus of the budget is a problem. I mean, it's tagged to the budget, a budget of recovery and growth. I think that at a time when the country is experiencing, its worst recession in decades, I think that if you have a budget that is styled a budget of recovery and growth, that is the way to go. And when you talk about, challenging the funding sources, and I mean, every budget is based on a series of assumptions. And I think that if you look at the 2017 budget compared with the 2016 budget, I mean, the same set of assumptions, you have an aggregate expenditure figure that is much higher. And I think that, I mean, the revenue that is expected is about 4.8 trillion, and the balance of that gives it 7.3 trillion budget is supposed to come from different sources, principal of which is borrowing. So I think that, by the time the National Assembly begins to look at the key indices, begins to look at the details of what the president has laid before it today, by the time the various committees look at, let's say, the revenue framework, I think that, the sources, to get the money to finance this budget would have been laid out. It's a different case entirely to now look at what becomes of it by the time the budget is being implemented. If, for example, you are supposed to get, non-oil receipts are supposed to get to about 1-point-something trillion, oil receipts about 3-point-something trillion. At the end of the day, will this be realized or not? Let's see the balance between domestic borrowing and foreign borrowing. In 2016, the aspect of foreign borrowing has suffered a great deal, because whereas the executive has exhausted the entire sum that was proposed to be borrowed domestically in 2016, it's not even able to do the same thing for the foreign component. And when we had some session with key members of the executive yesterday, looking at the MTEP document, we had a lot on this, and there were guarantees that 2017, in terms of the foreign borrowing, that a lot has already been done, the groundwork has been laid, to make sure that this doesn't suffer. I think that all this taken together in totality, I don't think it's fair really on the first day of presentation to assume that the revenue sources and all that are not going to be realized. I think it's a challenge for both arms of government to work together. I mean, what the president has laid today are estimates. The National Assembly is charged with the responsibility of processing these estimates. And I think that by the time we get more realistic working with the executive, we should come up with a budget that is realistic, that is practical, and that can be operated and implemented well.
All right, Chairman, Senate Committee on Finance, Mr. John Eno, thanks for sharing your thoughts with us on the News at 10 tonight. And in part 2, after the break, EFCC rearraigns former governor of Oyo State 8 years after being charged with 4.7 billion naira fraud. That's in a moment. Just stay with us.